Get the feel of wholesome refreshment with an ice-cold bottle of Coca-Cola, and you'll really feel better. Coca-Cola is the favorite beverage in countless homes. Young and old, rich and poor, all enjoy its delicious taste. Ice-cold Coca-Cola quenches your thirst. Coca-Cola is pure, wholesome refreshment. Thirst asks nothing more.
In 1915, if you walked into a drugstore or a soda fountain anywhere in America, you would have seen rows of glass bottles lined up on wooden shelves. They gleamed under the afternoon light, each one filled with a dark, fizzy liquid. Some were labeled Coca-Cola, others were not, and from across the room, you couldn't tell the difference. That was the problem. Coca-Cola had been sold since 1886, mixed fresh at soda fountains by men in white aprons who pulled levers and mixed syrup with carbonated water. But by the early 1900s, bottling had become the future. People wanted to take their Coca-Cola home, to drink it on their porches, at picnics, on hot summer evenings when the day's work was done. Bottling plants popped up across the South and Midwest, each one independent, each one using whatever bottles they could find. Most of those bottles were straight-sided, simple, practical, cheap. They were made by the Hutchinson Bottle Works or the Root Glass Company, pressed out in molds that had been used 1,000 times before. A paper label was slapped on the side, sometimes crooked, sometimes peeling at the edges, and that was all that separated Coca-Cola from a dozen imitators. And the imitators were everywhere. Coca-Nola, Coke, Kai-Ola. They copied the name, the script, the taste. In dim light or from behind a counter, a customer might grab the wrong bottle and never know until the first sip. Coca-Cola's trademark was being diluted, not by lawyers or pirates, but by confusion, by sameness. The company knew it had to do something. They needed a bottle that could be recognized in the dark, a bottle that even if you touched it without looking, you would know, instantly, instinctively, that it was Coca-Cola. A bottle so distinct that even if it shattered on the floor, you could identify the shards. That vision belonged to the bottlers, particularly those gathered at a convention in Atlanta. They were frustrated, tired of losing sales to lookalikes, tired of answering questions about whether their product was the real thing. They approached the glass manufacturers with a challenge: create something new, something unmistakable. Several companies were invited to submit designs. Most didn't bother. Glass was glass. Why reinvent it? But in Terre Haute, Indiana, a small glassworks called the Root Glass Company took the challenge seriously. They had a young supervisor named Alexander Samuelsson, a Swedish immigrant who understood molds and form. They had a modest factory floor, a few draftsmen, and a library across the street. And they had one sleepless night that would change everything. Because what emerged from that factory wasn't just a container. It was a silhouette, a shape that would be held by soldiers in foxholes, by teenagers on dates, by factory workers on lunch breaks, by people in every corner of the world. A shape so iconic that a century later, artists would paint it, museums would display it, and millions would recognize it without reading a single word. But that night, in 1915, none of that had happened yet. The bottle was still just an idea, a sketch on paper, a hunch in the hands of a glassblower, and a hope that design could mean something more than decoration. If you love stories of the past, the kind that remind us how small inventions shape the world, consider subscribing. We make these videos free so you can fall asleep learning something new about history. Your support helps us keep these quiet stories alive. Now let's get back to the video. Terre Haute, Indiana, was not a glamorous town. It sat along the Wabash River, a place of railroads and factories, red brick buildings, and coal smoke drifting over neighborhoods where immigrant families worked long shifts and came home tired. The Root Glass Company was one of many manufacturers in town, decent-sized, respectable, but not famous. When the call came from Coca-Cola's bottlers to design a new bottle, it wasn't sent directly to Root. The challenge had been issued broadly, a quiet competition among glassmakers. Most ignored it. A few sent in safe, predictable designs. But at Root, the plant superintendent, Chapman J. Root, saw an opportunity. He called a meeting. Around a table in a cramped office sat 4 men. Chapman Root himself, his assistant, Alexander Samuelson, a tall, quiet man with a Swedish accent, a draftsman named Earl Dean, and a skilled mold maker named Clyde Edwards. These were not celebrity designers. They were craftsmen. They worked with their hands. They understood heat, sand, and gravity, the way molten glass moved, how it cooled, how a mold had to be shaped if you wanted something both beautiful and functional. Root laid out the problem simply. Coca-Cola wanted a bottle that could not be confused with anything else. It had to be distinctive, memorable, recognizable, even in the dark. Earl Dean, the youngest of the group, spoke up first. "We need to know what Coca-Cola is," he said. "What's in it? What makes it Coca-Cola?" None of them knew. Coca-Cola's formula was a secret, locked away in an Atlanta vault, known only to a handful of people. The bottlers didn't know it. The public didn't know it. And certainly, 4 men in a glass factory in Indiana didn't know it. But they could guess. The name itself gave clues. Coca-Cola. Coca, leaves. Cola, nuts. Dean suggested they go to the library. It was late afternoon when Dean and Samuelson walked a few blocks to the Emmeline Fairbanks Memorial Library, a grand building with tall windows and shelves that smelled of old paper and dust. They asked the librarian for anything on coca plants or cola nuts. She brought them an encyclopedia. They flipped through the pages slowly, running their fingers over botanical illustrations. The coca plant had oval leaves, nothing special. But the cola nut, there it was. The image showed a ridged, pod-like fruit with deep grooves running vertically down its surface, swelling slightly in the middle. Dean stared at it. "That's it," he said quietly. Samuelson nodded. The shape was unusual, organic, curvaceous. Nothing like the straight-sided bottles flooding the market. If they could translate that form into glass, if they could make the ridges deep enough to feel, the waist narrow enough to grip, they might have something. They returned to the factory as the evening shift began. The furnaces roared. The air shimmered with heat. Dean sketched rapidly on a drafting table, his pencil moving in confident arcs. He drew the ridges. He drew the swell. He imagined how it would sit in a hand, how light would play across its curves. Samuelson watched, then took the sketch to Clyde Edwards. Edwards was the mold maker, the man who would turn the drawing into iron and wood, into something that could withstand molten glass at over 1,000 degrees. He studied the sketch for a long time, then nodded. "It's going to be heavy," he said, "and expensive, but it'll stand out." They worked through the night. By dawn, they had a prototype mold. It wasn't perfect. There were rough edges, uneven lines, but the form was there. The ridges caught the early light. The waist curved inward, just enough. Chapman Root saw it and smiled. "Make the sample," he said. And so they did. They heated the glass. They blew it into the mold. They let it cool slowly, carefully, until it could be lifted free. When it emerged, it gleamed like something alive. The bottle that came out of that first mold was not yet perfect. It was too heavy. The base was thick and clumsy, the neck slightly too short. If you filled it with liquid and capped it, it felt awkward in the hand, unbalanced. But even in that flawed first form, something was unmistakable. It didn't look like anything else. Earl Dean held it up to the window. Sunlight poured through the green-tinted glass, casting soft shadows across the ridges. He turned it slowly, watching the light shift and dance across the curves. Alexander Samuelson stood beside him, arms crossed, studying the silhouette. "It works," Samuelson said quietly. "Even empty, you know what it is." That was the test they had set for themselves. A bottle so distinct that recognition was instant. Not through a label, not through a logo, but through form alone. Chapman Root agreed. He knew they were onto something, but he also knew the design needed refinement. The weight had to come down. The proportions had to be adjusted. Coca-Cola's bottlers wouldn't accept something beautiful but impractical. It had to pour well, stack well, survive shipping in wooden crates on rattling train cars across the country. Clyde Edwards went back to his mold shop. He shaved metal here, adjusted curves there. He made the waist narrower, the shoulder more pronounced. He thinned the base so the bottle could stand steady without unnecessary bulk. Dean sketched variations, testing different heights, different flares at the top. Days became weeks. They blew dozens of test bottles, each one a little closer. Some cracked in the cooling process. Others came out lopsided, but slowly, through trial and error, the shape emerged with clarity. By late autumn of 1915, they had it. The final prototype was elegant. It stood about 7.5 inches tall, with deep vertical ridges running from shoulder to base, mimicking the kola nut pod that had inspired it. The waist pulled inward, just enough to fit comfortably in one hand. The glass was thick enough to endure rough handling, but light enough to be practical. When you set it down, it made a satisfying thunk. And when you closed your eyes and ran your fingers over it, there was no mistaking it for anything else. Root sent the bottle to Atlanta. He didn't include a long pitch or a marketing presentation. He simply packed the bottle carefully in a wooden crate, padded with straw, and sent it by rail with a short note. A bottle that can be recognized in the dark. In the Coca-Cola offices, executives passed it around a conference table. They held it. They turned it. They set it beside the old straight-sided bottles. The difference was undeniable. One of the bottlers spoke first. "This," he said, tapping the ridges with his finger, "is Coca-Cola." The room agreed. On November 16, 1915, the Root Glass Company was awarded the contract. The design would go into production. It would be refined slightly over the coming months, adjusted for mass manufacturing. But the essential form, the curves, the ridges, the unmistakable silhouette, would remain. What none of them knew as they shook hands and signed papers was that they had just created one of the most recognizable objects in human history, a shape that would appear on every continent, a form that would be sketched by artists, studied by designers, imitated by competitors, and held by billions. It wasn't just a bottle, it was an icon. The first production run of the new Coca-Cola bottle began in early 1916. The Root Glass Company's factory in Terre Haute hummed day and night, furnaces glowing orange, glass blowers working in shifts. Wooden crates filled with the new bottles were loaded onto railroad cars and sent south to Atlanta, then distributed to bottling plants across the country. At first, the reception was mixed. Some bottlers loved it immediately. They saw what the designers had intended, a bottle that stood out on crowded shelves, that customers would remember, that felt substantial and special. Others were skeptical. The new bottle was more expensive to produce than the old straight-sided ones. It held slightly less liquid due to its curved shape, and it was heavier, which meant higher shipping costs. "Why fix what isn't broken?" one bottler grumbled during a regional meeting in Tennessee. But Coca-Cola's leadership stood firm. They had seen the imitators. They had watched their brand get diluted in dimly lit general stores and rural soda fountains. They knew that in a rapidly growing market, distinction wasn't a luxury, it was survival. So they pushed forward. Bottling plants retooled their assembly lines. Workers learned to handle the new shape, stacking the bottles carefully in wooden carriers, 12 to a crate. The bottles clinked together with a different sound now, a softer, rounder tone. Delivery trucks carried them to drugstores, grocers, and gas stations. And slowly, people began to notice. A farmer in Georgia reached for one at a country store and paused. The bottle felt different in his hand, curvier, more solid. He paid his nickel, popped the cap, and took a long drink. The taste was the same, but somehow, holding that bottle made it feel more official, more real. A waitress in a Chicago diner set one down in front of a customer and watched his reaction. He picked it up, turned it slightly, and smiled. "Now that," he said, "is a Coca-Cola." Word spread quietly, the way most revolutions do, not through grand announcements, but through small moments of recognition. A mother buying a bottle for her son at a 4th of July picnic. A soldier on leave grabbing one from a train station vendor. A teenager on a first date sharing one at a soda fountain, their hands brushing as they passed the bottle back and forth. The shape became familiar, and familiarity became trust. By 1920, the new bottle was everywhere. Production had ramped up to millions per year. Coca-Cola bottlers who had initially resisted the change now swore by it. Sales were climbing. Complaints about imitators had dropped. The bottle had done exactly what it was designed to do. It made Coca-Cola unmistakable. But something else was happening. Something the designers in Terre Haute hadn't anticipated. The bottle was becoming more than a container. It was becoming a symbol. Artists began to notice it. Photographers framed it in still lifes. Advertisers featured it in paintings and posters, often without even showing the label. Just the silhouette, backlit, instantly recognizable. The curve of the bottle began to appear in Coca-Cola's branding, in storefront signs, in painted murals on the sides of brick buildings. It wasn't just packaging anymore. It was identity. Coca-Cola's executives realized they had something rare, a piece of design so strong it could carry the brand on its own. They began to patent and protect the shape aggressively, fighting off copycats and knockoffs. The bottle's design was registered as a trademark in 1960, one of the few packaging designs ever granted that status. By then, it had already traveled the world. American soldiers carried Coca-Cola to Europe during World War I, and the bottle went with them. It appeared in French cafes, English pubs, Italian markets. Everywhere it went, it carried the same message. This is Coca-Cola. This is America. This is the real thing. And all of it every bit of that global recognition started in a small factory in Indiana, where a few men looked at a drawing of a kola nut and saw not just a shape, but a future. When the United States entered world War II in 1941, Coca-Cola made a promise. Every American serviceman, no matter where he was stationed, would be able to get a Coca-Cola for 5 cents. It was a bold declaration, equal parts patriotism and marketing genius. And it meant that the bottle, the curved, unmistakable Coca-Cola bottle, would travel farther than anyone had ever imagined. Bottling plants were built near military bases, sometimes hastily, in places with names most Americans had never heard of. North Africa, the South Pacific, remote islands where palm trees swayed and the air was thick with salt and humidity. Coca-Cola followed the troops, and the bottle followed Coca-Cola. Soldiers wrote letters home describing the small comforts of war, a hot meal, a dry tent, a cold Coke. In those letters, the bottle appeared again and again, a symbol of home. One Marine, writing from Guadalcanal, described the moment a shipment of Coca-Cola arrived at his camp. "We hadn't seen those bottles in months," he wrote. "When they came off the truck, guys just stood there holding them, not even drinking, just holding them." The bottle became a token, a reminder, a slender glass thread connecting a foxhole in France to a front porch in Ohio. Coca-Cola shipped millions of bottles overseas, packed in crates, cushioned with straw, transported by ship and plane and jeep. The logistics were staggering. Glass was fragile. Shipping space was limited. But the company pushed forward, convinced that morale mattered as much as ammunition. And it did. Photographs from the era show soldiers in mud-streaked uniforms, helmets tilted back, holding Coca-Cola bottles with both hands. The images were used in advertisements back home, but they weren't staged. Those moments were real. The bottle had become part of the war effort, a small taste of normalcy in the chaos. But the bottle didn't just comfort American soldiers. It fascinated the people they met. In villages across Europe and Asia, local children encountered Coca-Cola for the first time. They stared at the strange, curvaceous bottle, ran their fingers over the ridges, tasted the sweet, fizzy liquid. Some loved it, some found it too sweet, but all of them remembered the bottle. When the war ended in 1945, millions of soldiers returned home. They brought back stories, photographs, and memories. And in many of those memories, a Coca-Cola bottle appeared, passed around a campfire, shared in a moment of quiet, held up in a toast to survival. The bottle had been globalized by war. Coca-Cola seized the opportunity. Bottling plants that had been built for military supply were converted to civilian use. The company expanded into Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Everywhere they went, they brought the same bottle, the same shape, the same promise. By the 1950s, you could find a Coca-Cola bottle in a cafe in Paris, a market in Tokyo, a cantina in Mexico City. The design never changed. It didn't need to. The shape spoke a universal language. Designers and marketers studied it, trying to understand its power. What made it so effective? Was it the curves, the ridges, the way it fit in the hand? The answer, they discovered, was all of it, and something more. The bottle had become a story. Every curve held a memory. Every ridge carried an association. It was the bottle a father handed his son at a baseball game. The bottle a young couple shared on a summer evening. The bottle a soldier held in a foreign land and thought of home. It wasn't just design anymore. It was emotion, distilled into glass. And that emotion would carry the bottle through the decades to come, through cultural shifts and technological revolutions, through changing tastes and new generations. The world would change, but the bottle would remain. By the 1950s, the Coca-Cola bottle had become so familiar that it was almost invisible. It sat on kitchen tables, in refrigerators, on diner counters. So common that people stopped really seeing it. But artists saw it. And in their hands, the bottle became something new. Andy Warhol was the first to make it famous as art. In 1962, Warhol created a series of paintings featuring Coca-Cola bottles. Not advertisements, not commercial work, fine art. He painted them in stark black and white, repeated them in grids, isolated them against empty backgrounds. The message was clear. This object, this mass-produced piece of consumer culture, was worthy of contemplation. What's great about this country, Warhol said, is that America started the tradition where the richest consumers buy essentially the same things as the poorest. You can be watching TV and see Coca-Cola, and you know that the president drinks Coke, Liz Taylor drinks Coke, and just think, you can drink Coke too. The bottle, in Warhol's view, was democratic. It belonged to everyone, and that universality made it powerful. Other artists followed. The bottle appeared in sculptures, photographs, collages. It was deconstructed, reimagined, celebrated, and critiqued. Some artists saw it as a symbol of American capitalism. Others saw it as pop culture iconography. A few saw it simply as a beautiful form. Norman Rockwell painted it. So did Salvador Dali. The bottle showed up in films, in music videos, in fashion photography. It transcended its original purpose. It was no longer just a container for a soft drink. It was a cultural artifact. Museums began to take notice. In 1950, the bottle was featured in an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It was displayed alongside chairs, lamps, and typewriters, examples of excellent industrial design. The curators didn't see it as advertising. They saw it as craftsmanship, as problem-solving made visible. The bottle's designer, Earl Dean, lived long enough to see this transformation. By the time he died in 1972, the bottle he had sketched in a Terre Haute factory had become one of the most recognized objects on Earth. He gave few interviews. He didn't seek fame, but in one rare conversation, he admitted he was proud. "I just wanted to make something people would remember," he said. "I think we did that." He had. The bottle's influence extended beyond fine art. Industrial designers studied it in schools. They analyzed its proportions, its balance, its tactile appeal. It became a case study in how form and function could merge, how a utilitarian object could also be beautiful. Architects borrowed from its curves. Fashion designers echoed its silhouette in dresses and accessories. The hourglass figure of the bottle became a visual metaphor, a shorthand for elegance and femininity. And through it all, Coca-Cola continued to produce the bottle, unchanged, while other brands redesigned their packaging every few years, chasing trends and focus groups. Coca-Cola stood still. The bottle remained the same in the 1960s as it had been in the 1920s, the same in the 1980s, the same today. That consistency became part of its power. In a fast-changing world, the bottle was a constant. It was nostalgia made tangible. It was memory you could hold. When someone picked up a Coca-Cola bottle in 2020, they were holding the same shape their grandparents had held in 1950. Artists understood this intuitively. The bottle wasn't just a product. It was a vessel for time, for continuity, for the quiet comfort of the familiar, and so it continued to appear in galleries, in installations, in public sculptures. A bottle made of glass, elevated to the status of monument. On July 20th, 1969, 2 men walked on the moon. The world watched, breathless, as Neil Armstrong's boot touched the lunar surface. It was a moment of science, of human ambition, of the impossible made real. And in the background of that achievement, quietly, was Coca-Cola. The company had been exploring ways to send Coca-Cola into space for years. It wasn't just marketing, though it was certainly that. It was also a genuine technical challenge. How do you carbonate a beverage in zero gravity? How do you package it so astronauts can drink it without creating a floating cloud of sticky droplets? Coca-Cola's engineers developed a prototype, a special can designed for space, with a pressurized system that could dispense the drink in microgravity. It was tested, it was refined, and eventually it flew. In 1985, Coca-Cola became the first soft drink consumed in space aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. Astronauts floated in the cabin, squeezed the custom dispenser, and sipped. It worked. The beverage traveled to orbit, and with it, so did the brand. But the bottle, the iconic glass bottle, couldn't make that journey. Glass was too fragile, too heavy. Space required different solutions. Still, the silhouette traveled. Coca-Cola's advertising featured images of astronauts, rockets, and the stars. And in those ads, the bottle often appeared, not literally in space, but symbolically. It was juxtaposed with the cosmos, with exploration, with the future. The message was clear. Coca-Cola was universal. It belonged everywhere humans went. This wasn't new. The bottle had always been a traveler. By the 1970s, Coca-Cola was sold in over 135 countries. The bottle appeared in African markets, Asian street stalls, European kiosks, South American cafes. It crossed deserts, mountains, oceans. It was carried by truck, by boat, by plane, even by camel. Photographers documented it. A Coca-Cola bottle on a wooden table in rural India. A bottle wedged into the sand on a Caribbean beach. A bottle sitting on a stone wall in the ruins of an ancient city. The bottle became a marker of globalization, for better or worse. Some saw it as a symbol of American cultural imperialism, a glass ambassador spreading consumerism to every corner of the globe. Others saw it as a sign of connection, a shared language in a fragmented world. Both were true. The bottle carried meaning wherever it went, and because its shape never changed, it became a constant in a world of variables. Whether you were in New York or Nairobi, Tokyo or Toronto, the bottle looked the same, tasted the same, felt the same in your hand. That sameness was powerful. In the 1980s, Coca-Cola launched one of its most famous campaigns, "I'd like to buy the world a Coke." The ad featured young people from dozens of countries standing together on a hilltop, holding Coca-Cola bottles, singing in harmony. It was idealistic, perhaps naive, but the image stuck. The bottle, in that moment, wasn't just a product. It was a symbol of unity, of shared experience, of a world brought closer together. And even as the world grew more complex, more divided, more skeptical, the bottle remained. It didn't preach, it didn't argue, it simply was. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, one of the first images broadcast around the world was of East German citizens crossing into West Berlin, many clutching Coca-Cola bottles. The bottle, once again, became a symbol, this time of freedom, of the end of isolation. It had traveled farther than anyone in Terre Haute, Indiana, could have imagined in 1915. From factory floors to battlefields, from art galleries to outer space, from hilltops to historic moments. And through it all, the shape never wavered. It was still the same bottle, the same curves, the same ridges, the same promise. Wherever you are, this is Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola faced a dilemma. The world was changing rapidly. Computers were shrinking. Cars were becoming more aerodynamic. Fashion, music, technology, everything was sleeker, faster, more modern. And yet, the Coca-Cola bottle remained a design from 1915. Marketing executives gathered in boardrooms and asked the question that had been whispered for years: should we redesign it? Focus groups were conducted. Designers were consulted. Prototypes were sketched. Some proposed sharper angles, a more contemporary silhouette. Others suggested transparent plastic, lighter and cheaper to produce. A few radicals even proposed abandoning the bottle altogether in favor of purely can-based distribution. The debates were serious. Millions of dollars were at stake. Consumer preferences were shifting. Younger generations didn't carry the same nostalgic attachment to glass bottles. But every time the company came close to a decision, something stopped them. It was the test. Coca-Cola would show consumers two bottles side by side, the classic contour bottle and a proposed redesign. And almost every time, people chose the original. Not by a slim margin, overwhelmingly. When asked why, they struggled to articulate it. "It just feels right," they said. "It's Coca-Cola." The bottle had become more than packaging. It was the brand itself. Changing it felt like changing the product, even though the liquid inside would remain identical. The shape carried too much meaning, too much history, too much emotional weight. So Coca-Cola made a rare corporate decision. They would leave it alone. The contour bottle would remain unchanged. It would continue to be produced in glass. It would stay on shelves alongside cans and plastic bottles, not as the primary format, but as the icon. This decision went against every instinct of modern marketing, which insisted on constant reinvention, on staying relevant. But Coca-Cola understood something deeper. Sometimes, the most powerful move is not to move at all. The bottle became a kind of anchor. While the company experimented with new products, Diet Coke, Cherry Coke, Coke Zero, the original bottle remained. While advertising campaigns came and went, the bottle stayed. While logos were refreshed and packaging was updated, the glass contour bottle stood still. And that stillness became its strength. In an age of constant change, the bottle offered continuity. It was a design that had survived the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, the digital revolution. It had outlasted trends, fads, and competitors. It wasn't old-fashioned. It was timeless. By the 2000s, the bottle had been in continuous production for nearly a century. Design historians marveled at this. In the entire history of consumer products, almost nothing had remained visually unchanged for so long. The Coca-Cola bottle joined a rare club. Objects so well designed that they became permanent. The paperclip, the wine bottle, the fork. These were designs that had reached a kind of perfection, not because they were flawless, but because they were complete. They solved their problems so well that any change would be a step backward. Earl Dean and Alexander Samuelson had achieved something most designers only dream of. They had created a form that didn't need improvement. And Coca-Cola, to its credit, recognized that. The company continued to protect the design fiercely. They trademarked the shape itself. They fought legal battles against imitators. They featured the bottle in anniversary campaigns, in museum exhibitions, in historical retrospectives. In 2015, Coca-Cola celebrated the bottle's 100th birthday. They released commemorative editions, hosted events, published books. The bottle was honored not as a product, but as a piece of cultural heritage. And it was. Somewhere in the world, at any given moment, someone is holding a Coca-Cola bottle. The same shape that a soldier held in 1944. The same shape that Andy Warhol painted in 1962. The same shape that was sketched in Terre Haute in 1915. The bottle that didn't need to change, because it had already changed everything. There is a woman in her 70s now, living in a small house with a porch that overlooks a quiet street. On summer evenings, she sits in a rocking chair, watching the fireflies blink in the dusk. Sometimes she reaches into a cooler beside her and pulls out a Coca-Cola bottle. The glass is cold against her palm. She wipes the condensation with her thumb and twists off the cap. That simple action, twist, hiss, sip, has been part of her life for as long as she can remember. She was 6 when she had her first Coca-Cola, bought from a corner store by her father. She remembers the way he handed it to her, still dripping from the icebox, how the bubbles tickled her nose on the first sip. She remembers sitting on the curb with her brother, passing the bottle back and forth, their knees scraped from playing in the street. She remembers high school dances where boys would bring girls Coca-Colas from the vending machine, the bottles clinking as they walked across the gymnasium floor. She remembers her first date, the nervous silence broken by the sound of a bottle cap hitting the pavement. She remembers her wedding day, the heat of July, the way someone handed her a Coca-Cola between photos, and how she laughed because her lipstick smudged the rim. She remembers the bottle sitting on the hospital nightstand the day her first child was born, a gift from a visiting friend. She remembers her father's funeral, the reception afterward, trays of sandwiches and bottles of Coca-Cola sweating on folding tables. She remembers holding one and not drinking it, just holding it, because it gave her hands something to do. And now, decades later, she sits on her porch and holds the same bottle. The shape hasn't changed, the taste hasn't changed, but she has. And that's why the bottle matters. Memory is a fragile thing. It fades, shifts, distorts, but objects can anchor it. A smell, a sound, a shape held in the hand. The Coca-Cola bottle has become that anchor for millions of people. It's not about the beverage, not really. It's about the moments the bottle witnessed, the summers, the celebrations, the small, ordinary joys that make up a life. Psychologists call this object-mediated memory. Certain things become tied to entire eras of our lives. A song brings back a summer. A photograph brings back a face. And for many people, a Coca-Cola bottle brings back childhood. The company understood this instinctively. Their advertising never really sold the drink. They sold the moment, the family picnic, the 4th of July, the pause that refreshes. And the bottle was always there, a silent witness. In archives around the world, there are thousands of photographs featuring Coca-Cola bottles. Not advertisements, personal photos, family snapshots, a father handing a bottle to his daughter, friends toasting at a backyard barbecue, a couple sharing one on a beach. The bottle appears in weddings, graduations, birthdays. It shows up in the background of history, civil rights marches, moon landings, protests, parades. Always there, always recognizable. And because the design never changed, the bottle became a bridge across generations. A grandmother and her grandson can hold the same bottle, literally the same design. and share a moment separated by 70 years? The grandson doesn't know that yet. He's 8. He just knows the bottle is cold and the soda is sweet. But someday, he'll be the one on the porch. He'll reach for a Coca-Cola bottle and remember this day. The summer heat, his grandmother's laugh, the way the sunlight caught the glass, and the bottle will still be there, unchanged, waiting. That's the quiet power of good design. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It simply persists, gathering meaning as the years pass, becoming more than it was ever meant to be. The Coca-Cola bottle was designed to be recognizable in the dark, but it became recognizable across time. It is late now. The world is quiet. Somewhere, a factory is still running, glass furnaces glowing in the darkness. Bottles are being made, just as they were made 100 years ago. The process has been refined, automated, perfected. But the shape remains. The ridges still run vertically. The waist still curves inward. The silhouette is still unmistakable. This is not an accident. It is a choice made again and again, year after year, by a company that understands what it holds. Not just a product, not just a brand, but a piece of the world's collective memory. The Coca-Cola bottle has outlived its creators, Earl Dean, Alexander Samuelson, Chapman Root. All of them are gone now. They never became famous. Their names don't appear in history books, but their work endures. Walk into almost any store on earth, and you will find it. The bottle sits on shelves in Tokyo and Toronto, in Lagos and London, in villages without paved roads and cities with millions of people. It has been touched by more hands than any sculpture, seen by more eyes than any painting. And yet, it remains humble. It doesn't demand reverence. It doesn't ask to be admired. It simply does its job. It holds a drink. But in doing that job well, in doing it beautifully, it became something more. Design. Critics have written essays about it. Art historians have traced its influence. Business schools teach case studies on its branding success. But perhaps the truest measure of the bottle's impact is simpler. It is this. You can close your eyes right now, and you can see it. You don't need a photograph. You don't need a description. The shape is already in your mind. The curves, the ridges, the way it tapers at the top. That mental image is shared by billions of people. A universal form. A common language. In 1915, a group of glassmakers in Indiana set out to solve a problem. How to make a bottle that couldn't be confused with anything else. They succeeded beyond measure, but they also did something unintentional. They created a symbol of refreshment, yes, but also of consistency, of memory, of a world that, despite all its chaos and change, still holds a few things constant. The Coca-Cola bottle is one of those things. It has survived wars, depressions, technological revolutions. It has been reinterpreted by artists, studied by scholars, cherished by generations. And through it all, it has remained itself. In a century where almost everything has been redesigned, reimagined, and reinvented, the bottle stands as a quiet testament to the power of getting something right the first time. Or rather, the second time, because the first bottle was too heavy. The first design needed refinement. But once it was right, it was never touched again. That restraint, that willingness to leave well enough alone, is rare. It takes confidence. It takes vision. It takes understanding that some things don't need to be improved. They just need to be. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, picture that bottle one more time. See the way the glass catches the light. Feel the ridges under your fingertips. Hear the soft hiss as the cap is twisted free, and know that somewhere, right now, someone else is doing the same, holding the same shape, sharing the same quiet moment, the bottle that changed the world, not through force, not through noise, but through form, through memory, through the gentle persistence of something made well and made to last. And that is enough